Babysitting is supposed to be an easy job. Watch some kids, make some money. But sometimes, the night takes a terrifying turn. These three babysitters thought they were in for a normal evening until they realized someone, or something, was watching them. Stay until the end. You might never look at babysitting the same way again. When a babysitter takes a late-night job for a quiet boy in an upscale neighborhood, everything seems routine, until the silence of the night begins to unravel. A strange sketchpad, unexplained warnings, and an unsettling presence concealed in the shadows transform an ordinary evening into something much darker. What started as a harmless job quickly becomes an experience that will haunt her forever. But was it all in her head? Or is there something, or someone, lurking in the darkest corners? Watch until the end if you dare. Babysitting jobs were never my favorite, but when Mrs. Lark approached me about watching her son, Ethan, I couldn't say no. She was a friend of my mom's and had offered double my usual rate since it was for a late night. They were attending a gala, she said, and it wasn't easy to find someone trustworthy to stay with Ethan. The Lark family lived in an upscale neighborhood, the kind where houses look more like art pieces than homes. When I pulled into the long, curved driveway, I couldn't help but feel a little out of place. Their house was a modern, glass-fronted structure with soft, glowing lights that spilled onto the pristine lawn. Mrs. Lark greeted me at the door, dressed in a sleek black gown, her husband lingering in the background, adjusting his cufflinks. Ethan's already had dinner, so it should be an easy night, she said, her smile bright but hurried. He's a quiet boy, spends most of his time drawing or reading. Just make sure he's in bed by 9. Mr. Lark stepped forward, and if you hear or see anything outside, ignore it. The motion lights in the backyard are overly sensitive, he said, his tone flat. Before I could ask what he meant, Mrs. Lark handed me a folder of emergency numbers, kissed Ethan on the head, and the two of them were gone. Ethan was waiting in the living room, sitting cross-legged on a pristine white rug. He was small for his age, 8, if I remember correctly, with dark hair that fell into his eyes. He barely looked up as I introduced myself, his focus fixed on the sketchpad in his lap. "What are you drawing?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He tilted the pad slightly, revealing a figure holding what looked like a lantern. The rest of the page was covered in heavy, black scribbles. "Just someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you draw a lot?" I tried to keep the conversation light, but Ethan only nodded and turned back to his work. The silence in the house felt heavier than I expected. After a while, I let him be and settled on the couch with my phone. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of a clock on the wall, the occasional rustle of Ethan's pencil on paper, it all seemed amplified. By 8:30, I suggested it was time to wind down for bed. Ethan didn't argue, which was a relief, but as I helped him gather his pencils and sketchpad, I noticed he'd added more to his drawing. The lantern now cast long, jagged shadows, and the figure seemed more defined, its face obscured by what looked like streaks of charcoal. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing to the figure. Ethan shrugged. "He watches." A chill ran through me, but I brushed it off. Kids have active imaginations, I reminded myself. After Ethan was tucked in, I returned to the living room. The house felt larger now, the open layout making every shadow seem more pronounced. I turned on the TV to fill the silence, but I kept the volume low, not wanting to disturb Ethan. Around 9:15, one of the backyard lights flickered on. Remembering Mr. Lark's comment, I ignored it. Probably just an animal, I told myself. But then it happened again, this time with the faintest hint of movement at the edge of the yard. I stood and moved closer to the glass doors that overlooked the backyard. The motion light had gone off again, leaving the yard in darkness. I scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. As I turned away, my eyes caught something on the counter, Ethan's sketchpad. He must have left it downstairs when we cleaned up. Curious, I flipped it open to the page he'd been working on. The figure now stood closer, its lantern glowing brighter, illuminating more jagged shadows. Beneath the drawing, in small, neat handwriting, Ethan had written, "Don't look at him." I closed the sketch pad quickly, my heart racing. It's just a drawing, I told myself. Just a kid's imagination. But the unease lingered. I checked on Ethan, finding him fast asleep in his bed, the covers pulled up to his chin. He looked peaceful, oblivious to the odd tension that had settled over the house. I returned to the living room, determined to get through the night without letting my nerves get the best of me. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp and unexpected, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I froze. Who would be at the door this late? The Larks hadn't mentioned anyone stopping by. I crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. No one was there. The doorbell rang again, this time longer, more insistent. My stomach twisted as I double-checked the peephole. Still no one. I turned on the porch light and opened the door a crack. The driveway was empty, the street beyond it quiet and still. I quickly shut and locked the door, my pulse racing. Back in the living room, I grabbed my phone and considered calling the Larks, but what would I say? That the doorbell rang? That I was spooked by a kid's drawing? I felt ridiculous. Then I noticed the sketch pad again, still sitting on the counter. Against my better judgment, I flipped to the next page. The same figure was there, but now it was holding something, a small rectangle that looked eerily like a doorbell. My hands trembled as I stared at the drawing. This couldn't be a coincidence. I heard a creak upstairs and nearly jumped out of my skin. "Ethan?" I set the sketch pad down and hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding. Ethan's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. He was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed. "Ethan, are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded but didn't say anything. "Did you hear the doorbell?" I pressed. He shook his head. "You're not supposed to look," he whispered. "What?" At him, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "He doesn't like it." My stomach dropped. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" But he just lay back down, pulling the covers over his head. I wanted to leave right then, to call the Larks and tell them I couldn't stay, but I couldn't abandon Ethan. So I sat in the hallway outside his room, listening to the silence and trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation for everything that had happened. As the minutes ticked by, I noticed something strange. The motion lights outside Ethan's window turned on, their glow faintly visible through the curtains. I peeked through the small gap in the fabric, my heart thudding. At first I saw nothing but the yard, empty still, but then, faintly, I noticed something just beyond the edge of the light, a dark shape barely distinguishable from the shadows. I told myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed frozen by the window until the lights flickered off again, leaving the backyard in complete darkness. Eventually, I returned downstairs, trying to shake off the paranoia. I made myself a cup of tea and settled back onto the couch. The clock on the wall read 10:45, just over an hour to go. But the uneasy feeling lingered. My mind kept returning to Ethan's drawing, the strange words he'd said, and the unexplained flicker of movement in the yard. The house seemed to grow colder, the silence deeper. At 11:15, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was followed by 3 loud knocks. My heart leaped into my throat. I crept to the door, clutching my phone, and peeked through the peephole. Again, no one was there. I debated calling the police, but hesitated. What would I even tell them? That I was scared because of a drawing and a few unexplained sounds? I felt foolish and vulnerable, trapped in this strange, silent house. I returned to the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. But the rest of the hour passed uneventfully. When the Larks returned around midnight, I practically bolted for the door. Mrs. Lark handed me an envelope with my payment, thanking me profusely. I nodded, muttered a quick goodbye, and left without looking back. It wasn't until I got home that I opened the envelope. Along with the cash was a folded piece of paper. It was one of Ethan's drawings. The same figure, now standing at the edge of what looked like my own driveway. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't babysat since. Imagine babysitting for what seems like an easy night, until a child tells you something that makes your blood run cold. Kayla thought it would be a simple job. Watch Lily, put her to bed, and go home. But from the moment she stepped into that house, something felt off. A strange warning from the parents, a mirror that seemed just a little too wrong, and a chilling message from an unknown number. By the time she realized the truth, it was already too late. Stay with us as we dive into a story that will make you question what you see in your own reflection. I had been babysitting for years, so when my neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, asked me to watch her daughter, Lily, for an evening, I didn't hesitate. She and her husband were attending an event downtown and wouldn't be back until late. The job seemed simple: dinner, a bit of TV, and bedtime. Lily was 8, old enough to be easy, young enough to still need sitter. When I arrived at their house, Mrs. Holloway greeted me at the door, looking slightly flustered. "Thanks again, Kayla," she said, slipping on her earrings. "Lily's already had dinner, so you just need to keep her company and put her to bed by 9. "Got it," I said, smiling. Before leaving, she hesitated for a moment. "Oh, and one thing. Lily has an overactive imagination. If she talks about a man in the mirror, just ignore it. It's a phase." I frowned. That was an oddly specific warning, but I nodded. "No problem." Mr. Holloway called from the car, and she rushed out the door. I locked it behind her, then turned to find Lily sitting cross-legged on the couch, staring at me. "You're the new babysitter?" she asked. "Yep, I'm Kayla." Lily nodded and turned back to the TV. "You don't look like the last one." That caught me off guard. "Last one?" She shrugged. "Never mind." I chalked it up to a kid's imagination and settled in for what I expected to be an easy night. The Holloway house was nice, modern, with large windows and sleek furniture. But the first thing I noticed was the oversized mirror in the hallway. It was massive, almost floor to ceiling, with a dark wooden frame. It reflected the living room and part of the kitchen, making the space feel even larger. Lily kept glancing at it. "Something wrong?" I asked. She shook her head, but kept looking at it out of the corner of her eye. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just our reflections. "Do you like mirrors?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. She hesitated, then said, "I don't like when they move." I frowned. "When what moves?" She didn't answer. Instead, she curled up on the couch and focused on her show. I let it go. Around 8, I got up to grab some water from the kitchen. As I passed the mirror, something made me pause. The reflection seemed off. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing supernatural or strange, just a feeling that something wasn't right. The angle, maybe, or the lighting. I turned back to the real room and then to the mirror again, but everything looked normal. Shaking off the unease, I grabbed my water and returned to the couch. Lily looked up at me. "Did you see him?" I froze. "See who?" She pointed at the mirror. "The man." A chill ran down my spine, but I kept my voice calm. "There's no one in the mirror, Lily." She just shrugged. "He only moves when you're not watching." I forced a smile. "Sounds like a fun imagination." She didn't answer. After putting Lily to bed at 9, I sat on the couch and texted my friend, Megan. "Me, babysitting gig. Easy money." Megan, "Nice. Any creepy dolls?" Me, "Nope. Just a weirdly big mirror." Megan, "Mirrors are sketchy. Don't stare too long, lol." I laughed and put my phone down. The house was quiet now, aside from the soft hum of the refrigerator. Then I noticed the mirror again. The reflection showed the empty hallway, the living room, and part of the kitchen. But something still felt wrong. The angle, the depth, it was hard to pinpoint. I decided I was just psyching myself out. I looked away and turned on the TV. An hour passed. Everything was normal. Then, as I glanced toward the mirror, I saw it. A shape in the reflection. I whipped my head toward the hallway, but nothing was there. My heartbeat picked up. I turned back to the mirror, just my own reflection, staring back at me. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked closer. The reflection seemed perfectly normal now, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Then I noticed something that sent a jolt of fear through me. The reflection of the hallway was slightly different. The picture frames weren't at the exact same angle as the real ones, and the shadow near the kitchen counter. There was no object in the real room casting it. I took a shaky breath and reached out toward the glass. My fingers hovered just above the surface. A creak from upstairs made me jump back. I forced myself to laugh. "Okay, Kayla, get a grip." I checked on Lily. She was fast asleep, her small frame curled under the blankets. I closed her door quietly and returned to the living room. As I passed the mirror again, I avoided looking at it. I didn't want to see anything else that might mess with my head. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Unknown, you need to leave." I stared at the screen, my throat tightening. I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I glanced at the mirror. My reflection looked normal, but my gut told me something was very, very wrong. Then Lily's voice came from behind me, soft and sleepy. "He knows you see him now." I spun around. Lily stood at the bottom of the stairs, rubbing her eyes. "What did you say?" I whispered. She yawned. "Nothing." I swallowed hard. "Lily, has someone been in this house?" She just looked at me, then turned and walked back upstairs without another word. I stood there, frozen. My phone buzzed again. "Unknown, don't look in the mirror again." I turned toward it anyway. This time, I wasn't alone in the reflection. Then I blinked and the image was gone. I ran to the furthest part of the sofa, covered myself almost completely with the blanket, and without looking away from the mirror once, I waited nervously. The Holloways came home an hour later. I didn't mention anything, just grabbed my things and left as fast as I could. The next day, I checked my phone. The messages were gone. No record of them. I never babysat for the Holloways again, but sometimes, even now, I catch my own reflection doing something just a little bit off. And every time, I look away. Was it just my imagination, a trick of the light, or something else entirely? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. Some things are better left unseen. When Emily took a simple babysitting job, she expected an easy night. Watch the kid, put him to bed, and go home. But from the moment she stepped into the house, something felt off. Carter was a quiet boy with a strange game, a locked cabinet, a mysterious notebook, and a set of rules she didn't understand. And then, someone knocked. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. Stay with us as we uncover a chilling story that will make you think twice before answering a knock at the door. When I agreed to babysit for the Thompsons, I expected an easy night. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, in one of those modern two-story houses that all looked the same, the kind where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Mrs. Thompson greeted me at the door, rushing as she slipped on her heels. "Thanks for coming, Emily. It's just for a few hours. Carter's already had dinner, so it should be easy. He's in his room playing." "No problem," I said, stepping inside. "Anything I should know?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook her head. No, just the usual bedtime at 9. Mr. Thompson called from the car outside, and she hurried out, leaving me alone in the house. I locked the door and glanced around. It was spotless, almost unnervingly so, the kind of clean that doesn't feel lived in. The air smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. Then I heard it, laughter from upstairs. Carter. I headed up the stairs to check on him. Carter was 6, a small, quiet kid with neatly combed blonde hair. I found him sitting on the floor of his room, surrounded by action figures. "Hey, bud," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "What are we playing?" He looked up, smiling. "It's a secret game." "Oh yeah, can I play?" He shook his head. "It's not for you." I laughed. "All right, fair enough. Want to watch a movie before bed?" He nodded and stood up. As he did, I noticed something strange. There was a small pile of coins on the floor beside his bed. Quarters, dimes, nickels. "What's with the money?" I asked. He shrugged. "It's part of the game." I didn't push further. Kids had weird habits. We went downstairs, put on a movie, and settled in. Everything was normal. For a while. Halfway through the movie, Carter suddenly looked up at me. "Emily." "Yeah." "Can you check under the sink?" I frowned. "What?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Just to make sure." "Make sure of what?" "That it's still locked." I studied his face. He looked serious. "All right," I said slowly. "I'll check." I got up and walked into the kitchen. The cabinet beneath the sink was secured with a childproof latch. I tugged it, locked tight. "See?" I called back. "All good." Carter didn't answer. When I returned to the couch, he looked relieved. Not just satisfied, relieved. I didn't ask, but a seed of unease had planted itself in my mind. After the movie, I sent Carter up to brush his teeth while I tidied up. As I picked up the blanket we'd been using, something small slipped out and hit the floor. A notebook. It was tiny, with a plain black cover. Definitely not mine. I opened it. Inside, in small, shaky handwriting, were just 2 lines. "If you hear it, don't open the door. If you see it, pretend you didn't." My skin prickled. "Carter," I called. No answer. I went upstairs, notebook in hand. His bedroom door was slightly open. I pushed it gently and peeked in. Carter was already under the covers, his small frame still. "Hey," I said softly. "What's this?" His eyes flickered to the notebook in my hand, then away. "Nothing." "Did you write it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "What?" His fingers twisted in the blanket. "Just in case." "In case of what?" He didn't answer. I left Carter's door slightly ajar and went back downstairs. The notebook sat on the coffee table, staring at me. Maybe he had overheard something scary. Maybe an older kid had told him something that stuck. I'd ask his parents when they got back. The house was quiet, too quiet. Then, a soft knock. I froze. It came from the back door, not the front, the glass sliding door that led to the backyard. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. Too late for a delivery. Too late for a neighbor. I stood up slowly, my heart thudding. The curtains were drawn. I hesitated, then carefully pulled them back just an inch. The porch light was on, but the yard was empty. No one there. But there had been. I stepped back, pulse racing. Carter's notebook flashed in my mind. "If you hear it, don't open the door." I grabbed my phone. No new messages. I typed one to Mrs. Thompson. "Hey, is anyone supposed to be coming by the house?" I watched the screen, waiting. Then, knock, Knock, knock. I sucked in a breath. This time, it came from the front door. I forced myself to move closer. The people was right there. I could check, but my body resisted. Instead, I whispered, "Hello." Silence. Then footsteps, slow, moving away from the door. I didn't look. I didn't want to. I went upstairs instead. Carter was still awake, sitting up in bed when I walked in. "Someone was at the door," I said. "Do you know who?" He bit his lip. "Carter." He glanced at the notebook in my hand. Then he whispered, "Did you open it?" I shook my head. He let out a breath. "Good." "Carter, what is going on?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It's part of the game, but not for you." A chill ran down my spine. "Who plays the game, Carter?" I asked. He looked down. My other babysitter didn't listen. She opened the door. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. "What happened to her?" He didn't answer, just lay down and pulled the blanket over his head. By the time the Thompsons returned, I'd already packed my things, forcing a polite smile as I hurried past them, eager to be anywhere else. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Thompson. "Thanks again. Hope Carter was good for you. By the way, sorry if he talked about his game. He's been obsessed with it since our last sitter left suddenly." I stared at the screen. My reflection in the car window looked pale, wide-eyed. Behind me, the Thompson house stood quiet, its windows dark. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in their house. But I never forgot the rules of the game. And I never, ever opened the door at night.